Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are taking a massive swing at one of the foundational questions in all of biology. Why are we social creatures?
We really are. We're diving into the sources you've provided, and specifically we're looking at E.O. Wilson's monumental project.
Right, his attempt to explain social behavior across, all organisms, not just us.
That's it. This analysis tries to find the unified evolutionary forces that drive social life everywhere, from simple colonial polyps right up to human civilization. Wilson frames this whole thing around what he calls the four pinnacles of social evolution.
The four great success stories of complex social living.
We got colonial invertebrates, the social insects, non-human vertebrates, and then finally man.
And this deep dive is our attempt to give you the blueprint for how those four groups, managed to crack the code of living together.
And setting the stage for all of this is a central question. Or actually, it's more of a powerful paradox. Yeah, why do we see these four distinct peaks of complex social life, and yet as life evolved from more primitive to more physically advanced forms, key social qualities, things like cohesiveness, cooperativeness, even altruism, they seem to decline.
Okay, let's unpack this. That is a jarring concept. So you're saying that the simplest life forms actually built the most perfect societies, and the more complicated a creature gets, the more selfish and brutal its social life becomes.
That's the core argument Wilson makes. The paradox is all about this inverse relationship between physical complexity and social harmony.
Wow.
And if we look at the extremes, the contrast is it's stark.
Okay, so lay it out for us.
On one hand, you have Pinnacle 1, the colonial invertebrates. Think of things like siphonophores or corals. Wilson famously called their groups perfect societies.
Go fix this.
The individual members, they're often called zoods, are frequently physically fused together. Their personal interests are just completely subordinated to the group. They're functionally indistinguishable from a single organism.
So a unified, perfect machine, driven entirely by the welfare of the group.
Exactly. Now, let's jump way across the evolutionary spectrum to Pinnacle 3. The non-human vertebrates, mammals mostly.
Right.
Their societies are, well, they're characterized by individual selection, almost entirely ruled by self-interest. Cooperation isn't some fundamental drive. It's just a pragmatic concession.
A concession.
Yeah, something an individual does simply to help raise its own personal reproductive rate.
The sources are genuinely grim when you read about the social decline here. In these groups, sterile castes are basically unknown. Altruism is rare.
And when it does happen, it's pretty much only directed toward your own kids.
The practical reality of this sounds awful.
It's brutal. The literature describes life in a baboon troop or, say, a fish school as inherently tense and brutal. The sick and the injured, they're just left behind.
And there's that chilling example with the lions and langur monkeys.
Oh, yeah. The death of a dominant male is very frequently followed by infanticide. The new male systematically murdering the youngest offspring of his predecessor. It's a raw power play.
The lesson seems to be that structural complexity equals structural conflict. The group's integrity is totally secondary to just maximizing your own genetic fitness.
That really sets a fascinating baseline for understanding the different evolutionary paths, doesn't it?
It does.
So let's start at the beginning, at that high watermark of cooperation, Pinnacle 1, the colonial invertebrates.
The apex of altruism.
They really are. The colony is functionally a superorganism.
And the secret to that perfection is really just two simple biological facts, right? The first one is about their physical structure.
Yes, their physical malleability.
Yeah.
Their body plans are relatively simple. They're often sedentary, which makes physically joining up and coordinating just vastly easier.
Like easy plumbing.
That's a great way to put it. You don't need the incredibly complex rewiring of nervous systems that highly active modal organisms do.
So their biology makes it easy to link up. But if you're trying to understand altruism across evolutionary time, the real clincher has to be the second mechanism.
It is. It's their genetic identity.
Yeah.
In these colonial forms, reproduction is often just budding or fission.
So the whole colony is made up of genetically identical individuals. There's no variance.
None.
Now, when we talk about social evolution, we always use this concept of kinship. The coefficient of relationship, right? We call it Tor dollars. Can you break down the math there so it's memorable?
Absolutely. The coefficient of relationship, $2, just measures the proportion of genes you share with someone by common descent.
Yeah.
For you and a full sibling, it's 1/2.
Okay.
But in the case of these colonial invertebrates, $2 equals 1.
One. A perfect one. And biologically, that means if one little zood does something to help another zood, It's literally helping 100% of its own genetic code.
That's it. It's not really altruism, it's just delayed self-interest because the self is the whole colony. And this absolute genetic identity makes the evolution of unlimited altruism possible. The individual's only goal is to optimize the group structure. No genetic conflict means they can achieve perfection as a superorganism.
That makes total sense. No conflict, no discord. Okay, so now let's move to Pinnacle 2, the social insects.
Ants, termites, wasps, bees.
These guys are physically separate, they're modal, way more complex than a coral, and yet they still achieve this incredible social integration. Sterile casts, complex communication. They're the great evolutionary compromise.
They certainly are. You see this intense altruism like suicidal defenses.
The bees that sting and die, or the ants with the exploding abdomens.
Yeah, exactly. They have specialized castes for foraging, for defense, but they are limited by their separateness.
Yeah.
Their societies run on what Wilson called impersonal intimacy.
The impersonal intimacy.
They recognize the collective identity, the colony-specific smell, the caste, but not the unique individual.
And this is key. Unlike the perfect invertebrate colonies, you can actually see conflict here. We know, for example, that in some species, female workers can still lay their own unfertilized eggs, which become males.
Right, there's this constant low-key struggle between the queen and the workers over who gets to produce the next generation of males.
Yeah.
The discord exists because their genetic interests aren't perfectly aligned.
So how did they pull it off? How did they get so complex despite being separate and motile?
Hmm.
Wilson gives two main drivers for this.
He does.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The first is just a sheer statistical advantage they had. It's about adaptive radiation.
Exactly. Adaptive radiation is this explosion of new species adapting to different environments.
Yeah.
And insects just underwent an unparalleled version of this. We're talking about over 800,000 described species.
Wow.
That's roughly 3/4 of all known animal species on the planet. They were the first major group to successfully colonize land, so they had a massive ecological head start.
So the argument is just a numbers game. Let's try to visualize this. Imagine the invention of advanced sociality is a super rare event. Say a 1 in a trillion chance, $10, $12 per species per year.
Okay, well, if you have a phylum with a tiny number of species, like, say, 7,000 species of annelid worms, the chances of them hitting that evolutionary jackpot are basically zero.
Right.
But if you multiply that tiny probability by 800,000 species, like the insects have, you suddenly make it statistically probable for advanced sociality to pop up multiple times, just by chance alone.
It's just a numbers advantage that gives them the statistical edge. And that leads directly to the second, more focused argument, the haplodiploidy bias.
This is a specific genetic system, and it's found in the Hymenoptera, so ants, bees, and wasps. And it explains why they have a near monopoly on eusociality.
They've evolved sterile casts at least 11 separate times.
At least. And it's because the Hymenoptera have this unusual system where fertilized eggs become female and unfertilized eggs become male. That genetic quirk completely changes the kinship math. Well, because of haplodiploidy. Female workers share, on average, more genes with their sisters than they would with their own potential daughters.
So if we put that into the Tor values again, what does that calculation look like?
In a typical full sister relationship in Hymenoptera, the coefficient of relationship, $3, is 3/4.
3/4, okay.
But their relationship to their own potential offspring is only 1/2. So it is genetically more advantageous for a worker to give up personal reproduction and instead join a sterile caste to help rear her sisters, who were genetically closer to her. This is the genetic lever that produced these altruistic castes.
That's a phenomenal insight. That's the engine of their altruism. But 3/4 is still a lot less than the perfect one we saw in the colonial invertebrates.
And that 25% genetic difference, that quarter-point gap between perfection and the insect reality, is precisely what explains the discord, the minor struggles, the workers laying their own eggs. They are a hugely successful compromise, but they're genetically imperfect superorganisms.
Which brings us across the gap to Pinnacle 3, non-human vertebrates. Mammals, birds, fish. Here, the maximum kinship among the closest relative siblings, or a parent and their offspring, is just 1/2.
Right. 12-2 DARs. There's no special genetic advantage whatsoever for sterile castes, which is exactly why we don't see them.
The math just doesn't work.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the genetic roadblock is clear. Vertebrate social evolution is fundamentally driven by optimizing individual fitness, not group selection like the two pinnacles below them. A simple 2-2 just isn't enough genetic currency to buy the kind of high-level altruism you need for a sterile caste.
So, if it's not extreme kinship pushing them, what is the force that drives these complex creatures to be social at all?
It's the rise of greater intelligence. This intelligence allows for behavior that's far more complex, adaptable, and based on personalized individual relationships.
So, it's less about genetics and more about politics.
You could say that. Members can still behave selfishly, but their intelligence allows them to cooperate more effectively by, as Wilson puts it, deftly picking its way through the conflicts and hierarchies of the society. It's a constant calculation of risk, reward, and relationship.
The complexity isn't based on physical union or shared genes, but on knowing who you can trust and who owes you a favor.
Exactly. And this shift to intelligence comes with four critical properties that define the vertebrate social pinnacle. And they also happen to be what limits the overall integrity of the group.
Okay, let's walk through them. What's the first one?
Communication. Vertebrates have vastly enriched communication. They use at least 2 or 3 times more basic displays than insects. But the real depth comes from context.
Meaning the same call can mean different things.
Completely. It depends on the time, the place, the relative rank of who's talking and who's listening.
Mm.
They also use scaling subtle changes in intensity to convey subtle changes in mood. This means they can transmit maybe an order of magnitude more information per second than an insect can.
And that complexity in communication ties right into the second property, which seems crucial for these personalized societies.
It is personal recognition. This is a trait that's almost universal in birds and mammals, unlike an insect responding to a general class, like a colony odor.
A dominant monkey needs to know exactly which subordinate is challenging him. A wolf needs to know its history with every member of the pack.
Precisely. That memory for personal history and relationships is the foundation of their cooperation, which leads to the third property, learning, play, and tradition.
Right.
Vertebrates learn quickly to adjust to rapidly changing social dynamics. If a monkey suddenly drops in rank, every member of the troop instantly knows the new rules. And social play facilitates invention and the transmission of traditions behaviors learned by one animal and then spread through the group.
So socialization here is really a tool to enhance your own fitness within the group.
Entirely. Which gets us to the fourth property, the formation of selfish subgroups.
Because they can recognize individuals, judge relationships, and remember favors.
They naturally form cliques, kin groups, mated pairs, alliances, all existing within the larger society, and each of these subgroups is pursuing its own ends, optimizing its own fitness calculation.
And that inherently limits the group's cohesion. You might have a troop of baboons, but it's not really one society. It's a collection of competing, self-interested families and individuals operating under a very fragile, calculated truce.
Exactly. The whole group will never be as cohesive as an insect colony. The trend of declining altruism holds fast.
Which finally brings us to Pinnacle 4. Man, we are structurally still vertebrates. Yet Wilson argues we intensified those four traits, communication, recognition, learning, and subgroup formation, to such an extreme that we became a distinct fourth pinnacle. This is the great reversal.
It is. We broke the old vertebrate restraints, and not by fundamentally reducing our genetic selfishness, that's still hardwired in, but by acquiring the intelligence to plan for the future and consult the past.
So how does that intelligence translate into the kind of extreme cooperation we see in human societies? Cooperation that, at a behavioral level, often rivals the insects.
We developed the capacity to establish long-remembered contracts and profitable acts of reciprocal altruism. Unlike a baboon, who might groom a partner based on immediate memory, humans can space these reciprocal favors out over long periods.
Even across generations.
Yes, across generations, trusting that the social contract will hold. This involves our, intuitive preoccupation with kinship ties, our gut-level kin selection calculus, and, of course, our unique syntactical language.
Which makes all these transactions, negotiating, lying, promising, remembering, highly efficient.
The result is truly extraordinary. Human societies can approach the cooperativeness of insects, but they far, far exceed them in communication and adaptability. And this reverses that billion-year downward trend in social evolution, where altruism declined as complexity rose.
This is a phenomenon that only happened once.
That's right. Compared to the multiple origins of the other three pinnacles, this happened just one time. Our capacity to achieve this level of cooperation while maintaining our individual reproductive autonomy is what makes us structurally unique among all social animals.
So what does this all mean when we look back across this vast landscape of social evolution?
Wilson's framework gives us a really concise recap of the three major evolutionary drivers that define these four pinnacles.
Okay, so first, the colonial invertebrates. They reached peak altruism because of absolute genetic identity, with their coefficient of relationship, $3 being equal to 1. They literally are the group.
Then you have the social insects. They achieve their high complexity through statistical opportunity and a strong haplodiploid genetic bias, which
Yep.
allowed for spoilers of three-quarters. They are the genetic compromise built on a statistical lottery.
And finally, the vertebrates, including us. We achieve our sociality through increasing intelligence and personalized relationships, but we're operating under the hard limit of that canonical kinship of $3 equals 1/2. We are the structural roadblock, forced to innovate socially because of our genetic limits.
And those four pinnacles just represent four fundamentally distinct, successful routes to achieving social complexity, each limited or enabled by its physical structure and its genetic relatedness.
And that great human reversal, our ability to achieve such an extraordinary degree of cooperation with little or no sacrifice of our personal survival and reproduction, thereby defying that long-term trend, is described by Wilson as the culminating mystery of all biology.
And if that mystery hinges on our intelligence, our ability to plan and negotiate our future relationships, what does that make you wonder about our own future social structures? Especially as we continue to intensify those uniquely human traits through technology and, global connectivity.
A truly provocative thought to leave us with. Thank you for sharing your sources with us and for joining us on this deep dive into the evolutionary blueprints that define social life on Earth. We hope this gave you a clearer view of why some societies are perfect and others are just perpetually conflicted. Until next time.